Aries' 28th birthday celebration, someone presented him with a woman right in front of me. I lost my usual composure, shattered a wine glass, and caused chaos at the party. Later, I left alone, carrying my luggage. Everyone believed that Alani, who had no one to depend on, would only last 3 days before returning in defeat. Aries showed no concern, remarking, "She's just an orphan. Where could she possibly go without the Aries family?" As days turned into weeks, some even speculated that I had died. It was only then that Aries tried to call me, only to discover that my number was no longer in service. Later, at a prestigious art exhibition, a side-profile portrait caught Aries' eye. He offered an exorbitant sum to purchase it, but the artist Antonio declined, saying, "This is my favorite portrait of my wife, and I cannot part with it." At Aries' 28th birthday banquet, I wore the most stunning dress and walked arm in arm with him. However, as soon as we descended the stairs, Aries released my hand and left me standing alone. The guests' attention followed him, and I was forgotten in the corner. One by one, they presented their gifts, which Aries casually directed the butler to collect. It wasn't until someone presented a breathtaking beauty that all eyes turned back to me, filled with sympathy, mockery, and amusement. Aries, usually expressionless, seemed momentarily distracted. The woman bore a striking resemblance to his late first love. "Giving me a woman in front of Alani, you sure have guts," Aries said with a teasing smile. The gift-giver tried to appease him, saying, "Alani is generous. She surely won't mind." It wasn't that I didn't mind, but they were certain I wouldn't dare to object. As an orphan raised by the Aries family, how could I dare to defy the new head of the household? Aries twirled his wedding ring, a faint smile in his eyes. "Since Alani has agreed, take her away." Before he could finish, I was already by his side. I glanced at the woman before me. The gift-giver had indeed been thoughtful, knowing exactly what Aries liked. Suddenly, I felt exhausted. I could no longer maintain the facade of grace that my grandmother had taught me. With a gentle push, I toppled the champagne tower behind me, sending crystal glasses crashing to the floor. The room erupted into chaos as glass and wine scattered everywhere. Someone exclaimed, "Alani's gone mad." I had ruined Aries' birthday banquet, but he didn't seem to care. The butler quickly arranged for the guests to leave, and the mess was swiftly cleaned up. The beauty remained, standing quietly beside Aries, her demeanor eerily similar to his first love. In contrast, I appeared completely unhinged. Aries held the woman's hand, toying with her fingers as he looked at me indifferently. "Why are you so angry? If you don't want to see her, I'll have her stay elsewhere." "Don't worry. I swore to grandmother that I'd never take your place, Alani." The woman beside him also tried to calm me, saying, "Alani, why be angry? A man like Aries could never have just one woman. I merely admire him, and I won't affect your position." I removed the ring from my finger and placed it on the table in front of Aries. He raised an eyebrow. "Here's your ring back," I said. Aries picked it up, tossing it into the air. The diamond sparkled before landing back in his hand. He then handed it to the woman beside him. "A few $1 million ring, and Alani just tosses it aside like it's nothing," he remarked coldly. Aries stood up and instructed the butler, "Find a few teachers to teach my wife some manners. I don't want to see such disgraceful behavior again." After a few steps, he turned back and threw his own ring on the ground. It rolled to a stop at my feet. "If you don't want the ring, then throw them all away," he said before leaving with his entourage. The sound of the car engine faded into the night. The butler sighed beside me. "Madam, Why did you have to upset the master? You know he holds resentment toward you. I picked up the ring at my feet and tossed it into the trash. Dean, you can go about your business. Don't worry about me, I said. The butler sighed again and left. I went upstairs alone, changed out of the elaborate dress, and put on a simple white shirt. I found a suitcase and packed all my belongings from the wardrobe. While other couples might need to consider divorce agreements after a fight, Aries and I were only connected by a pair of rings. No one could have imagined that the wedding, which stunned the entire city, lacked a legal marriage certificate. I still recall Aries' words during the ceremony. Only Wan's name will ever appear on my household register. Susan Yen, you shouldn't have married me, he said. But what choice did I have? I married him anyway, the man I had loved since my teenage years, clinging to the hope that one day I might win his heart. Yet, in the end, I became nothing more than the titular Alani in everyone's eyes, a wife in name only. As I dragged my suitcase out of the villa, the silence was deafening. It reminded me of the rainy night when my grandmother first brought me home. 13-year-old Aries stood on the stairs, his cold gaze fixed on me before he turned and headed to the kitchen. Moments later, he returned with a cup of warm milk. I booked a flight, traveled for 6 hours, then drove another 3, arriving in a remote southern town. They say that as people age, they long to return to their roots. But even someone without a home can yearn for one, even if no family remains. I rented a small courtyard in the town. The local dialect felt both familiar and foreign. Having left at a young age and lived in the northern city for so long, I had nearly forgotten how to speak it. Fortunately, my neighbor in the adjacent courtyard was also an outsider, having arrived just before me. One day, while buying groceries, I struggled to understand the dialect of an elderly woman. My neighbor stepped in to help. The next day, I made corn pancakes to thank him. I learned he was an artist seeking inspiration. Fresh out of college, he radiated youthful energy. Being away from the people and events of the northern city, I suddenly remembered. I was only 25. Yet, living in Aries' house, constantly upholding the persona of Alani, I had felt old and weary. I bought flowers from the street and planted roses throughout the small yard. A rocking chair sat beside the flower bed. The garden at Aries' house had been filled with yellow roses, Colette's favorite. Years ago, when Grandma suggested uprooting them, Aries flew into a rage. If the roses are gone, there's no reason for me to come home, he said. After that, no one mentioned it again. Colette and those roses became untouchable in the Aries household. One afternoon, there was a knock on my courtyard door. It was Antonio, wearing a hoodie and a backpack, his smile bright as he greeted me. Sister, I'm heading up the mountain to paint. Want to join me and enjoy some fresh air? Antonio was well prepared. He carried camping gear and art supplies, refusing my offer to help. I'm strong. Carrying this is no trouble, he said. As we hiked, we talked about the past and the future. My past felt dull, revolving entirely around Aries and his household, leaving me as nothing more than the figurehead Alani. But Antonio was different. He had endless stories and dreams. Life is an experience, he said. Right now, my dream is to become a famous artist, and I'm going to give it my all. At the mountain peak, we watched the sunset. The golden light bathed everything in a surreal glow. Below, the small town looked peaceful and serene. Antonio set up the tent and handed me food and water. He sprawled on the mat beside me, hands behind his head, gazing at the star-filled sky. Sister, you should try looking at the stars like this. It's a completely different feeling, he said. I had never considered lying down to watch the stars before, but Antonio didn't give me time to hesitate. He tugged me onto the mat beside him. Once I lay down, the stars felt close enough to touch. In that moment, I made a decision: to be brave and step forward. Running away was just an escape. I needed to make new friends, explore the world, and reach a point where even if he stood before me, it wouldn't matter anymore. That night, I slept deeply. Despite being in a simple tent outdoors, I felt more at peace than ever. The next morning, I stepped out to find Antonio already at work, his easel set up, his expression focused. The rising sun warmed my skin as I gazed at the horizon, where the sun was beginning its ascent. This marked a fresh start for me as well. Antonio, my neighbor, suddenly called out, "Sister, don't move." His excited voice caught me off guard, and I froze, only able to glance at him from the corner of my eye. It turned out he was using me as a model for his painting. Once he finished, I stretched my stiff neck, realizing that being a model wasn't as easy as I had imagined. "Let me massage your neck," Antonio offered. "Thanks for being my model." His hands were strong, and I closed my eyes, enjoying the relief of his massage. As we walked down the mountain, Antonio enthusiastically shared his newfound inspiration. I had seen the painting, and while it looked impressive, I couldn't fully appreciate the artistic details. When we returned, Antonio quickly disappeared into his house. I turned on the TV, and Aries' face suddenly appeared on the screen, startling me so much that I stepped back. My hand hovered over the remote, but I hesitated. I felt grateful for the decision I had made the previous night. Aries often appeared on TV and online, and I knew I couldn't run away forever. In the news interview, Aries looked unchanged. When asked about recent rumors of marital issues, his expression remained indifferent. "She threw a fit," he said. "She'll come back after some time away." Everyone envied me, a helpless orphan raised by Aries' grandmother and later married into the family. They saw it as a blessing from a past life. But only those inside knew the truth. To everyone else, I was invisible, resented by Aries, and reduced to a mere title in the Aries family, like a floating weed with no roots. Every year when the yellow roses bloomed, Aries would have the servants cut them and fill the vases around the house. The piano in the glass conservatory was wiped daily by the servants. Colette was dead, but Aries constantly reminded me of her presence. During the interview, the host asked, "Is it true that your argument with Alani was about your assistant, who you've been seen with lately?" Aries frowned impatiently, his hand instinctively reaching for the wedding ring on his finger, only to remember it was no longer there. He recalled how I had returned the ring, standing my ground and daring to run away. He remembered the panic in the butler's voice that day when he called, saying, "Madam is gone." When he got home, half of my closet was emptied, leaving only his suits hanging there, lonely and untouched. He thought it was just my way of forcing him to send away the woman who looked like Colette. He knew that what I cared about most was Colette's things, especially someone who resembled her. But so what? Grandma was gone, and I had no family. My only support was him. When I was a child, I would hide alone whenever I felt wronged. Back then, Grandma spoiled me. Aries didn't have the patience to look for me now. He believed I'd return sooner or later, realizing that life outside the Aries family wasn't so easy. "So I told the butler," he said, "an orphan, where else can she go after leaving the Aries family? Nobody is allowed to look for her. Notify me when she comes back." With Aries' impatience, the host quickly shifted the conversation from emotions to business. Talking about work, Aries seemed much more relaxed. It seemed like I was someone who made him frown at the mere mention of my name. I poured myself a glass of ice water and took out my laptop to start writing my resume. In this small town, most of the residents were elderly. It was a great place for retirement but offered very few job opportunities. If I wanted to work, I needed to leave. I wrote until evening, then stretched and got up to prepare dinner. A simple meal of 3 dishes and a soup. As I sat at the table, I suddenly thought of Antonio next door. I wondered if he was done with his work. When he painted, did he get as absorbed as Aries did with his work, often forgetting to eat? Back when my grandmother was still around, Aries would often get stomachaches from skipping meals. So whenever I had time, I would bring him food to his office. In the beginning, his secretary would stop me outside the office, and I'd wait for 1 or 2 hours. Eventually, Aries got used to it, letting me interrupt his work so he could eat before continuing. I sighed, threw on a jacket, and knocked on Antonio's gate. I heard nothing from inside. Just as I was about to leave, the gate suddenly opened. Antonio's initial impatient look melted into a smile when he saw me. "Big sis," he said, "I was just painting you, and here you are at my door." Antonio still had a paintbrush in his hand, with splotches of paint on his clothes and face, looking a bit messy. But his smile was so bright that the paint seemed like a charming detail, making him appear more vibrant. "Have you eaten yet? Want to come to my place for dinner?" Antonio, hearing my invitation, suddenly clutched his stomach and dramatically groaned. "I'm starving. You always take care of me, big sis. Let me just put down my brush." In the following days, it seemed like Antonio and I formed some kind of unspoken agreement. He came over for meals every day and helped me clean up before leaving. He even took over gardening tasks, planting flowers and vegetables in my yard. It's a shame I don't have a brother. If I did, I'd want one like him. I sent my resume to a few companies and received some interview invitations. On the day I decided to leave, I got up early to say goodbye to Antonio. As I opened the door, I noticed several black sedans parked in front of Antonio's house. A few men in suits, probably bodyguards, were standing by the cars. I hesitated for a few minutes before walking over. As I approached, one of the bodyguards reached out to stop me. "Don't touch her." Antonio came out from the house, his previously sunny demeanor replaced with a cold seriousness. He grabbed my hand and pulled me into the yard, slamming the gate behind us. "You all stay outside," Antonio ordered. The bodyguards exchanged glances but eventually replied, "All right." "Big sis, did you come to invite me to dinner?" Without the bodyguards, Antonio seemed to regain his earlier cheerfulness. "No, I came to say goodbye." Antonio's voice suddenly rose a few notches. "Where are you going?" I explained how I'd sent out resumes and received interview invitations. "Even though this place is great, that day on the mountain, you said every day is a new beginning, full of possibilities. I want to give myself a fresh start and live with no regrets. So, have you let go of that person in your heart, big sis?" Antonio asked, his tone catching me by surprise. I looked at him, puzzled. Antonio blinked at me. "Don't treat me like a kid. An artist's eyes are sharp, you know." His candidness made me feel slightly embarrassed. "Yeah, I guess I have. Where are you planning to work, big sis?" "North City." Although I had considered moving to a city farther away from Aries, I'd spent my entire life in North City since my grandmother took me in, growing up there, going to school, and making friends. Why should I force myself to live in an unfamiliar city just because of Aries? I didn't need to go through the trouble of adjusting to a new place. Then I'll go with you, big sis. My family's looking for me anyway. To my surprise, I ended up riding in Antonio's car to North City. As the anxiety about facing Aries again loomed, Antonio's endless chatter about his plans made it gradually fade. Life in North City went more smoothly than I expected. The interview went well, and I received a notice to start next week. I rented an apartment close to the company. However, after disappearing for 2 days, Antonio reappeared as my new neighbor. One day, as I went out to take out the trash, I saw workers moving furniture into the apartment next door. A quick glance inside revealed Antonio, tall and lean, directing the workers where to place the furniture. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "I wanted to surprise you, but I guess you caught me," Antonio replied, naturally bending down to take the trash bag from my hand. "I've been missing your cooking, so I moved next door to mooch off you again." His sudden appearance was indeed a bit of a pleasant surprise. Living in a strange place, it felt safer having him as my neighbor. "All right, I'll cook a few dishes later to celebrate your move." For convenience, we decided to have a hot pot at home. The red oil broth boiled away, and Antonio fished out a piece of tripe, placing it in my bowl. After one bite, the spiciness hit me, and I quickly grabbed my drink to wash it down. "So, you can't handle spicy food, huh? You said you love hot pot, so I thought." "It's fine. Maybe I'm just not used to it anymore." How long had it been since I last had hot pot? I couldn't even remember. It used to be my favorite food. When my grandmother was still alive, we'd have it together. She'd have the mild broth, and I'd have the spicy one. Once, when Aries was working late into the night, the food I brought him had already gotten cold. Since it was snowing outside, I suggested we go out to eat instead. I took him to a hot pot restaurant. Aries always preferred light flavors, so I ordered a split pot with both spicy and mild broths.
But the entire time, Aries frowned. On the way back, he said, "Don't eat that again, it leaves a smell all over you." After that, I hadn't eaten spicy hot pot again. If you stop eating something long enough, even your taste buds forget what they once loved. But soon enough, I was sweating and rediscovering the joy of eating hot pot. After dinner, Antonio cleaned up the table, tidied the kitchen, and opened the windows for ventilation. He even took out the trash as he left. Life back in North City turned out to be much more peaceful than I had anticipated. The media stopped talking about Alani, and no one from Aries' family came looking for me. I guess I was never important enough for anyone to care. The media had become increasingly curious about Aries' assistant, who he always kept by his side. I casually scrolled through the photos secretly taken by paparazzi. How ironic. Did Aries truly love Colette that much? In the photos, Aries bent down, letting the woman adjust his tie. When getting into the car, he carefully protected her head. On a rainy day, the woman held the umbrella high over him, and he took it, tilting it toward her. So, love for someone could be transferred so easily, just because of a similar face. Aries had always been very protective of Colette's identity. No photos of her were ever leaked. Everyone was speculating whether Aries had completely abandoned me. If I were still living in Aries' house, I might be waiting for a husband who wouldn't come home. But now, I'm busy organizing plans, busy with meetings. "Antonio, I told you not to act so clingy with me." I pushed away the head resting on my shoulder. Antonio, dissatisfied, pushed my laptop further away and said, "Aren't I a big, handsome guy right in front of you? Why are you daydreaming about an old man?" It was the first time I'd heard someone call Aries an old man. I couldn't help but laugh at the thought of how Aries would react if he heard that. When I finally stopped laughing and looked up, I noticed Antonio had a serious expression. Is he the one who hurt you before? Aries, from the family conglomerate? I know him. I looked at him in surprise. As far as I remembered, I had never seen Antonio at Aries' house. When I was little, my mom made me call him uncle. I burst into laughter, clutching my stomach and collapsing onto the couch. Haha. He's only 4 years older than you, and you called him uncle. Haha. Antonio pinched my cheek. He looks older. Aries had been involved in the company since childhood and appeared more mature than his peers. So, are you the missing Alani from the Aries family? Antonio's face suddenly loomed closer. Only then did I realize that, while laughing, I had ended up resting my head on Antonio's lap. I tried to push him away and sit up, but for once, he wasn't as easygoing as usual. He stared at me, as if determined to get an answer. Yeah. So, does that make me your secret lover? Antonio laughed at his own words. I playfully slapped him. Don't talk nonsense. Besides, I've already left Aries' house and returned the ring to him. Great. I'll get a lawyer, and you'll be divorced tomorrow. No need. We never had a marriage certificate. I smiled bitterly. Without a marriage certificate, there was no need for a divorce. The only bond we had was the ring, a symbol of marriage. Maybe Aries had been with Alani for so long that he'd forgotten we didn't even have a certificate. Perfect, why don't you help me get one then? As I held the freshly printed marriage certificate in my hand, I was momentarily lost in thought. Back then, I thought Aries' picture would be on my marriage certificate. Never did I imagine the groom would be someone else. Last night, under Antonio's relentless pleading, I agreed to fake a marriage to appease his family. Antonio took the certificate from my hand. I'll take this back and show it to my family. Otherwise, my mom will keep thinking I'm lying to her. The marriage didn't feel real at all. 3 years ago, there had been a grand wedding, full of ceremony but without a marriage certificate. It all seemed like a fake display of happiness for outsiders. Now I had the certificate, but no wedding. Yet, I felt more grounded. Maybe because there were no expectations, there would be no disappointments. Antonio brought back good news after showing the certificate to his family. My parents have agreed to let me hold an art exhibition. This time, it's going to be my best work. A month later, Antonio's exhibition was a success. I had to work late that day and didn't leave the office until almost 8 p.m. When I arrived at the exhibition, I spotted someone who looked a lot like Aries standing near the entrance. I shook my head. It must be someone with a similar build. Inside the gallery, many of the paintings looked familiar. A few girls passed by me, excitedly clutching their catalogs. Hurry, hurry. Antonio's just up ahead. We have to get his autograph this time. I heard this is his last exhibition. If we miss it, we'll never get a signed piece again. I followed their gaze and saw Antonio, towering above the crowd, patiently signing autographs. I thought this was his first exhibition, how could it be the last? I scanned the room and noticed an introduction to Antonio near the entrance. Turns out, he was already a famous artist, with previous works that had toured nationwide, selling for astronomical prices. Suddenly, I felt hesitant to approach him. The Antonio described in that bio didn't seem like the same boy who always acted playful and clingy around me. I quietly left. As I exited, I spotted Aries standing by the roadside, frowning as he spoke on the phone. So I hadn't been mistaken earlier. Aries kept dialing a number he would have never contacted before. Even though he knew it would only lead to an automated message saying Alani's number was no longer in service, he didn't know any other way to reach her. Seeing the painting earlier had sent a jolt through his heart. The woman in the portrait looked so much like Alani, but not quite. The woman's eyes were filled with life, brighter than the sunrise behind her, radiant and full of vitality. Alani wasn't like that. She was more like still water, never showing any ripples. Even a clay figure has a temper, but Alani was like water, squeeze her, and not even a spark of anger would show. When she was pushed too far, she would simply hide. He had once seen her crying by the greenhouse. Upon hearing his footsteps, like a frightened kitten, she'd run back to her room to hide. Back then, he hated how she could never present herself properly. Despite being Alani, she could only pretend to be poised in public, but as soon as she returned to the Aries household, she reverted to her timid self. He had wanted to buy the painting and hang it in Alani's room, to let her see it every day, hoping it might inspire her. But Antonio had said, "This is my favorite portrait of my wife. Sorry, I can't part with it." For some reason, hearing those words gave him a strange sense of relief. The woman in the painting wasn't Alani after all. Yet, after leaving the exhibition, he suddenly felt an urgent need to reach Alani. She'd been angry for long enough. It was time for her to come home. After hearing the automated response once more, Aries lost his patience and turned to his bodyguards. "Find my wife. When you do, bring her back." The bodyguards arrived at Antonio's house while he was setting the table for dinner. When the door opened, they rushed in, but Antonio blocked their way. "Who are you looking for?" The bodyguard's eyes landed on me, holding a spatula. "Madam, Aries wants you to come back." It had been months since I last heard that title. For a moment, it felt like a lifetime ago. "Don't call her that. She's my wife now." Antonio pushed the bodyguards out the door. They exchanged glances, and one of them dialed Aries. "Aries, it seems like she's married." Aries arrived quicker than I had expected. Within minutes, he stood at the door, his face dark and angry. The bodyguard stepped aside as Aries tried to push past Antonio, but Antonio wouldn't budge. "Pull him away from me." Aries shouted angrily at the bodyguards. "Aries, you barged into my house, trying to take my wife. That doesn't seem appropriate, does it?" Only now did Aries finally look straight at Songwenjin. "So, the person in your painting is my wife? Shouldn't you be the one explaining things to me?" "Explain what?" "We've already got our marriage certificate. She's my legal wife." Aries sneered, his gaze locking with mine from a distance. "Alani, you've really grown bold, haven't you? Running off behind my back to marry someone else? Come back now, and I'll pretend nothing happened." He extended a hand toward me. In the past, whenever he reached out, I would always grab his hand without hesitation. But this time, I didn't move. "Aries, I've already returned the ring. From now on, we're even." "Even? My family raised you, and with just one sentence, you think you can cut ties with me? Alani, are you even speaking like a human being?" Aries' eyes were bloodshot. In the confusion, Antonio wasn't quick enough, and Aries rushed forward, grabbing my hand tightly, nearly crushing my wrist. "You'll go divorce him right now. Isn't marrying me what you wanted? Get the divorce, and then we'll get our certificate." With my free hand, I slapped Aries across the face. The entire room fell silent. It took Aries a long time to realize what I had just done. "Aries, what are you going crazy for? I've left your family and don't want that marriage certificate anymore. You can take anyone home now, and we can both move on, okay? Why should I let you go? My family raised you. If you're going to die, you'll die as a part of the Aries family." Aries suddenly lifted me, but just as he reached the door, he was blocked by the Song family bodyguards who had just stepped out of the elevator. "Aries, if you take her today, I'll have you charged with kidnapping. Surely you don't think I'm incapable of protecting my own wife, do you?" I was still in shock. I had never imagined a scene like this would unfold. I thought that by leaving, Aries would feel relieved. I figured when I suggested we part ways, he might even be happy. But now, this display, who was it for? The tension in the room escalated quickly, and soon the bodyguards from both sides were engaged in a chaotic fight. Antonio got involved too, and thankfully, he won. But he had taken a punch to the left side of his face from Aries, and it looked serious. "Aries, you're too old for this kind of brawling. You should stop trying to act tough." I tugged on Antonio's sleeve, worried Aries might retaliate later. Aries had never fought anyone before, and now he was in such a pathetic state. Even the bodyguards on both sides had bruises. "You guys take him back. Don't come looking for me again," I said, pulling Antonio back inside the house. He covered his face, frowning. "Honey, he hit me hard. Do you think it left a mark?" I pulled out the first aid kit. Stop calling me that. Let me put some ointment on it for you. Just as I got closer, he turned his head and kissed me on the lips. That works much better than ointment. You didn't mind when I called you wife earlier in front of Aries, though. I shoved the iodine solution into his hand. You said we were just getting the certificate, not really getting married. Antonio smirked, looking satisfied. I just wanted a legal claim to you, so no one with the last name Lou could steal you away. You tricked me into marriage. Yeah, and I gave up my job at the company for it. If this is a trick, I'm stuck with it for life. If you divorce me, I'll not only lose a wife, but I'll be stuck working for the company forever. How tragic would that be? I finally understood why he had said earlier it would be his last art exhibition. I poked his injured cheek. You're such an idiot. Well then, don't leave me. At least I'll be happily suffering for the rest of my life. I nodded, and Antonio took it as his cue to push further. Wife, can I kiss you openly now? Before I could answer, his lips were already on mine. The situation spiraled out of control, and Antonio acted like a kid who had finally gotten his candy. By the time I tried to push him away, I had already melted in his arms. Antonio, stop. Don't worry, I'll be gentle. In my dazed state, I finally understood what Antonio meant when he talked about his stamina. Antonio moved us to a new house. He said he was worried Aries might come and harass us again. It was peaceful for a while, until Antonio took me to a bridal shop to pick out a wedding dress. I had no idea we were even planning a wedding. I've been preparing since the day we got our certificate. When I painted that portrait, I was already dreaming of making you my beautiful bride. Antonio was involved in every detail of the wedding planning. Occasionally, his mother would pull me aside to ask for my opinion on certain things. One day, while we were choosing a hotel, we unexpectedly ran into Aries in the courtyard garden. I wanted to avoid him, but he saw me first. Sinyan, come back, okay? I'll take care of you like Grandma wanted. Isn't our family your home? Are you going to abandon both me and our home? I pulled my hand out of his grasp. I spent so many years in the Aries family, but you never treated me like family. Now, I found a new family. Please, don't disturb me anymore. Antonio's parents adored me, especially after learning that my parents had passed away and I had no other relatives. Antonio's mother hugged me and cried, saying she would be my mother from now on. I loved the home Antonio had given me. It was a place where I truly belonged. In the Aries family, my only relative was Grandma. And with her gone, there was nothing left to miss. I saw Antonio come out, and I waved, running toward him. He wrapped my coat tighter around me and whispered to the hotel manager about some details. Aries stood there, his gaze fixed on my retreating figure. But that figure never looked back. Bonus scene, Aries perspective. I prided myself on never misjudging anyone in business. But somehow, I had never truly understood Alani, the person closest to me. I thought she was dependent on me, easy to control. But after one trip away, she came back stronger. When Grandma insisted we get married, I agreed, but only staged a wedding for her. I deliberately didn't register our marriage with her, and she endured it, without even complaining to Grandma. I purposely placed Colette's favorite yellow roses in front of her, watching her face turn pale, and finally understood what bothered her. So when the woman who looked like Colette appeared in front of me, I agreed without hesitation. As expected, Alani's face turned extremely sour. But I never imagined she would lose her temper and even throw away our wedding ring. I always thought she was just a runaway child. I never realized she had already grown up, without me noticing. I'm no longer her only support, she has a job, new friends, and even got married. I waited downstairs for the bodyguards to bring her back, only to hear them say that she was already married. I almost dropped my phone. She said she wanted to cut ties with me, like she was determined to sever all connections with me for the rest of her life. In my agitation, I lost control and resorted to violence. But in the end, I couldn't even win against that brat. I remember disliking him when we were kids. I was only a few years older than him, and yet he called me uncle. Now that he's grown up, I dislike him even more. But when Alani saw that he was hurt, her eyes were full of concern. Maybe she didn't even realize it herself, her eyes were only on that brat, while when she faced me, all I saw was caution. Suddenly, I felt like I had lost something I might never get back. The invitation to their wedding ended up in my hands, and the smiles on their faces in the photo were blinding. Back then, we had our own grand wedding too. But I was so indifferent, I didn't even bother to take a photo with her. I left everything to the butler and stayed detached, like I was just a guest at the event. She must have been disappointed by that wedding, right? All these years, I grew used to having her by my side, took her efforts for granted, and assumed she would always be there. It wasn't until now that I realized some people, once lost, will never belong to me again. She no longer wants the Aries family, and I, too, have been left behind, forever trapped in the Aries family.